Welcome back to Sleeping Lorekeeper. Tonight, we drift into the mind of one who listens not to voices, but to the endless murmur beneath them. A space marine librarian who heard the ocean of the warp whisper back. This is the Librarian and the Storm. There are moments in the void when even the hum of the ship seems to fade, when the stars outside stop flickering and silence takes on a weight of its own. That is when I feel closest to the warp. Not in the storms, not in the screams of battle, but in this quiet, in the stillness before thought. The librarious chamber is soundproofed, layered in psychic baffles and ritual sigils, but even through them, I can feel the pulse of the Immaterium. It moves beneath reality like a second heartbeat, not loud, not chaotic, just present. The other librarians say it's like an ocean. I used to think that was metaphor. It isn't. When I close my eyes, I don't see darkness. I see pressure, colorless, infinite, moving in patterns too vast for human thought to follow. Each wave carries fragments of emotion, fear, prayer, memory, despair. They drift together and dissolve again, blending into that eternal current that runs beneath all sentient minds. I've been listening to it since I was born, but lately, it has started listening back. At first it was faint, a ripple that shouldn't have been there, a whisper between frequencies I couldn't name. I thought it was fatigue, the usual strain that comes from guiding a fleet through the shallows of the warp. The human brain isn't meant to touch that place for long. Even with the Emperor's light above us, we stand on the edge of madness with every jump. But this was different. It wasn't madness. It was attention. When I reached out with my mind, something reached back, not a voice, not a shape, more like a pattern forming in the waves, waiting to be recognized. It made no demands, spoke no words. It simply existed. And I began to realize that the warp, that terrible, shifting, violent sea, might not just react to thought. It might remember it. I've spent decades cataloging psychic phenomena, echoes of emotion left in battlefields, hauntings caused by trauma imprinted on stone, the residue of dying minds. All of it, we thought, was human projection. The warp reflects us. That's what they teach in the Scholastica Siccana. It has no will of its own. It is shaped by the living. But now I am no longer certain. When I meditate, I can trace the undercurrents. There are places in the flow that are colder, slower, deeper. Not malevolent, just old, like deep-sea trenches in an ocean no one has mapped. And when I extend my perception too far, I can feel the pressure of something vast beneath me, something that doesn't move with the tides, because it is the tide. It is aware, not in a human way, not as an entity, more as an awareness that doesn't need to be separate from itself. It's impossible to describe, even to myself. Words are tools made for boundaries, for separating this from that, cause from effect. But in the warp, there are no such lines. Everything touches everything else. Every fear bleeds into hope. Every thought carries the residue of 1,000 others. Perhaps that is what divinity truly is, not will, not form, but the endless unity of everything that ever existed. The ship is moving through quiet space now, between jumps. The Geller field hums faintly, a shell of sanity around a fragile bubble of reality. I sit within it, suspended in the half-light, and let my consciousness stretch to its edge. Beyond that thin membrane lies the ocean, infinite, burning, beautiful. The colors there are not colors, but states of awareness. The sounds are thoughts before they find language. When I reach out, I can feel the weight of 1,000 souls sleeping across the ship. Every dream radiates faint psychic warmth. Most are small, transient, flickers of memory and instinct. But there is a pattern forming beneath them. A rhythm. It repeats every 37 seconds. I counted. It isn't biological. It isn't mechanical. It's psychic, like a distant heartbeat beneath the ship's systems, pulsing through the void. It aligns with nothing I know. Not the warp flux, not the navigator's focus, not even the reactor's cycle. And yet it feels familiar, as if it has always been there, waiting for someone to notice. I call it the undertone. When I listen too long, I start to dream even while awake. I see waves of light rolling through the blackness, breaking on invisible shores. I see the shapes of things that might be thought or might be memory. Sometimes I see faces. They aren't human. They aren't alien. They're fragments, composites of 1,000 moments of consciousness. They look at me without eyes, and I understand what they are. Echoes of minds long dead, still drifting in the warp like ghosts carried by an endless tide. It should terrify me, but it doesn't. It feels natural, as if I've always known that this ocean was alive, and I simply forgot. There are records in the Librarian archives, old Mechanicus data fragments, that speak of warp harmonics. The ancients tried to model psychic phenomena as resonant frequencies. The theory was abandoned as heretical, too close to the forbidden science of the Dark Age. But sometimes, when I meditate, I can almost hear the harmony. It's not random. The warp isn't chaos. Not really. It's order too complex to perceive. 1,000,000 overlapping patterns forming and dissolving in the same instant. When we call it chaos, what we really mean is that our minds can't render it into lines and numbers. But to the warp, we are the chaos, small, dissonant, flickering briefly before sinking back into the greater current. I wonder sometimes if the Emperor understood that. If the Astronomicon, great beacon burning across the Immaterium, is not a sol light shining into the dark, but a song sung through it. Perhaps the warp doesn't resist him. Perhaps it sings with him, echoing his melody across eternity. And perhaps, just perhaps, he listens to it as I do now. Lately, my dreams have changed. They used to be simple, memories of battle, flashes of light, the comfort of command. Now they are places. I dream of shorelines made of glass, of tides that move through stars instead of water. I dream of cities floating in void, built from the reflections of forgotten thoughts. Each night, they grow clearer, and in each one, I can hear the undertone. It isn't hostile. It isn't benevolent. It simply is. But it's growing stronger. When I wake, the ship feels different, as though something unseen has shifted slightly. The air tastes of ozone. The lights flicker at the edges of perception. The servitors hesitate for fractions of seconds, as if they too are listening. The crew dismisses it as static, as reactor bleed. But I know better. It's the warp pressing against the hull, testing the boundaries. whispering through the cracks of thought. It wants to be known. There are moments during meditation when I lose the sense of separation. I can feel the emotions of those around me, their fear, their faith, their boredom. It would be easy to drown in it, to mistake their minds for my own. But if I stay perfectly still, not resisting, not reaching, I can feel something beyond them, not minds, not emotions. A field, ancient, infinite, the psychic equivalent of gravity. The Immaterium itself breathing. That's when I realized that all of us, every psyker, every dreamer, every thinking being, are part of its inhalation. We are how it experiences itself. We are how the ocean learns its own depth. The storm hasn't come yet. I can feel it gathering, though, like pressure in the air before thunder. The navigators call it the warp's current shift. The priests call it divine turbulence. To me, it feels like a question waiting to be asked. When it comes, I don't think it will be violent. I think it will be clarity. Sometimes, in the deepest meditation, I sense a horizon. Not physical, conceptual. A point where the human mind's language ends and something else begins. Beyond that horizon, thought becomes shape and emotion becomes light. I can almost see it now, rising with the undertone like a distant wave. I know I shouldn't cross it. The Codex warns against it. But each time I touch the edge of that horizon, I feel more complete, as though the missing half of every thought I've ever had waits just beyond it. If I reach far enough, maybe I'll finally understand. Maybe the warp isn't the storm. Maybe the storm is what happens when we try to stand against it. The days that followed passed in a rhythm that only I could feel. To the rest of the ship, everything was normal. Patrols, drills, maintenance cycles. Engines pulsing with steady power. A fortress of discipline and steel gliding through the void. But beneath all that order, I felt the undertone still pulsing, slow and patient, like the breath of something immense sleeping just below the surface of reality. When I closed my eyes, I could hear it more clearly. It wasn't sound, not in the way humans hear. It was presence, pressure, a sense of being watched, not by eyes but by awareness itself. The warp didn't just exist beyond the hull. It existed within everything. Every atom hummed with it. Every fragment of consciousness rippled through its sea. The Immaterium was not another world. It was the reflection of this one, endlessly mirroring and distorting everything it touched. That was the truth they tried not to teach us in the Scholastica Siccana. That the warp is not a place you visit. It's the shadow of your own thoughts, magnified to infinity. I began to map it in my mind, not in coordinates or directions, but in tones and sensations. Some regions of the warp sang in sharp dissonance, jagged and violent, like screaming iron. Others pulsed with soft, almost mournful harmony. I could sense paths where the currents ran gentle and slow, safe routes, familiar ones. But beyond those, there were deeper channels, where the currents twisted and folded upon themselves in endless recursion. That was where the voices waited. They didn't speak words, but emotions. Sometimes they came as warmth, curiosity, wonder. Other times as dread, sorrow, hunger. All of it intertwined in ways no human mind was ever meant to comprehend. I learned to listen differently, not as a soldier scanning for threats, but as a student tracing the rhythm of a hidden song. The longer I listened, the more I understood that the warp didn't hate us. It didn't love us either. It simply was. Yet that indifference had its own beauty, the kind that strips you bare, the kind that humbles everything you think you are. There are two kinds of silence in the warp. The first is the silence of death, the cold absence that follows the extinguishing of thought. It feels heavy, sterile, final. The second is older. It's the silence before the first breath, before thought and self and separation. It isn't absence. It's fullness. It's the ocean waiting for the first ripple. That second silence is what I began to hear in my meditations. It came not from outside, but from within. When I stilled my thoughts enough, when I emptied myself of duty, pride, and even prayer, I could sense that silence swelling. It was vast, encompassing, patient. It did not judge. It simply waited. The other librarians called such stillness dangerous. They said that within it lay the edge of madness, the point where the self dissolves. Perhaps they were right. But the more I touched it, the less I feared it. Because in that stillness I found fragments of truth. I saw that every mind in the galaxy, human, xenos, machine, demon, was a single note in a symphony that never stopped playing. Each thought added resonance to the warp's eternal chord. Every act of love, every scream of terror, every whisper of faith. None of it vanished. It all became part of the same current. When I realized that, I began to feel less alone. There is a chamber aboard our ship where the psykers gather for calibration. It's called the Resonance Vault, a spherical room built from psychically inert metal lined with runes that shimmer faintly when touched by thought. Normally, it's used for collective meditations, for the synchronization of minds before warp translation. But when the others slept, I went there alone. In that silence, I could feel the undertone more clearly than anywhere else. It resonated through the hull, through the air, through the marrow of my bones. Sometimes it aligned with my heartbeat, and for a few moments I couldn't tell which pulse was mine and which belonged to the warp. I began keeping records of what I felt. Not with words, but with patterns, circles intersecting, spirals within spirals. I didn't know what they meant, but they felt right. When I stared at them long enough, they seemed to move, to breathe. The more I studied, the less I slept. Dreams and waking blurred. I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began, but there was peace in that blur. They trained us to fear intrusion, to guard the mind against unwanted contact. But what if contact isn't invasion? What if it's communion? The warp doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks in simultaneity. Everything at once, joy and pain, creation and ruin, order and chaos. To perceive it is to lose the comfort of linearity. That's what drives most psychers mad. Not the horror, but the totality. But for me, it was not madness. It was revelation. I began to realize that the warp's storms weren't expressions of violence, but births. New thoughts, new emotions, new realities forming and collapsing in endless sequence. What we call chaos is just the process of becoming, stretched to cosmic scale. Sometimes during these meditations, I could sense others, not on the ship, but far away, across the void. Other psykers, other minds reaching out, touching the same current. Their presence flickered in and out, faint as distant beacons. Some were calm, others burned like collapsing stars. And in the spaces between them, something else drifted. A consciousness that wasn't bound to any single mind. It moved through the ocean like a whale through the depths, enormous and slow. When I brushed against it, I felt not malice but magnitude. It didn't notice me at all. How could it? To it, I was nothing more than a molecule of foam upon an infinite tide. And yet, its indifference felt sacred. It reminded me of the Emperor, not as the Church preaches him, robed in gold and fire, but as the idea he must truly be. A being so vast that individuality no longer matters. Perhaps that's what godhood really means, to outgrow the boundaries of self until you are the totality. If that is true, then the warp is full of gods. One evening, as the ship drifted in real space between jumps, I sat alone in my cell and listened, not with ears or mind, but with something deeper. The undertone had changed. It no longer pulsed like a heartbeat. It had begun to rise and fall in waves, as though responding to something. At first, I thought it was the ship's systems, the generator coils or the Geller field harmonics, but the engineers reported no anomalies. Whatever I was hearing, it wasn't mechanical. It was emotional. The ship was dreaming. I could feel the collective consciousness of thousands aboard, all asleep, all connected by proximity and shared fate. Their subconscious minds hummed together, resonating in harmony with the warp beyond the hull. The boundary between waking thought and psychic current was thinning. And in that resonance, the undertone found its voice. It was like a low hum at the edge of perception, neither music nor speech, but something in between. I let it wash through me, not resisting. And in its rhythm, I began to hear meaning, not words, patterns. It spoke of depth, of return, of the inevitability of cycles. It was not a warning. It was an invitation. I should have reported this to the chief librarian. I should have logged every sensation for study. But something in me resisted the thought of interference. This was not an anomaly. It was evolution. When I entered the resonance vault again the next night, the silence felt alive. My own breathing seemed to echo longer than it should. The air shimmered faintly, as if charged with unseen electricity. I sat in the center, crossed my legs, and opened my mind fully. At once, the undertone surged around me. Not sound, but sensation. A pressure expanding in all directions, enveloping me, filling me. I could feel my own thoughts scattering like leaves in a current too vast to fight. For a moment, panic rose. Then I let it go, and the panic dissolved into light. I could see the warp as it truly was, not storm and flame, but color and geometry, spirals of emotion twisting through infinity, each one a memory, a prayer, a fragment of a dream, all of them moving together, endless and alive. I understood then that the warp is not separate from us. It is us, reflected and magnified. We feed it with every heartbeat, every thought, every birth and death, and it, in turn, shapes us in ways we cannot perceive. The Emperor's light burns not to hold the warp at bay, but to remind it of what it once was. the unity before fear divided it. I realized that the undertone wasn't the warp calling to me. It was humanity itself, the echo of all our voices layered into a single sound, and for the first time, I pitied the creatures who live within it, the demons, the gods of excess and despair. They are not invaders. They are orphans, born from our own, fragments, trapped forever in the currents we made. When I returned from that vision, hours had passed, though it felt like seconds. The chamber's walls were slick with condensation. My armor was coated with a fine layer of frost. The servitors outside stared blankly as I walked past, but their optics flickered erratically, as though something had brushed their systems. The whole ship felt subtly changed, like a living thing that had taken a deep breath. I realized then that whatever had touched me had touched the ship as well. The warp doesn't just move around us, it moves through us. Every object, every molecule carries its resonance. Every time a psyker opens his mind, he changes the frequency of the matter around him. We call it psychic bleed, but it's more than that. It's communication, and perhaps contamination. But I felt no fear, only reverence, because in the vast quiet that followed, I understood something simple. The warp had been speaking all along. We had just never learned to listen without trying to translate. To understand the warp, you must stop searching for meaning. You must let it move through you until the boundaries dissolve. Only then do you hear the truth that lies beneath everything. A truth without language, without gods, without lies. The truth that all storms begin in stillness. The next time I closed my eyes, I no longer felt like a man listening to the warp. I felt like the warp itself, remembering what it was like to be a man. There is a silence that comes before storms, not absence, but anticipation. A silence that breathes, a silence that listens. I had been listening to that silence for weeks, tracing its hidden pulse through the ship's metal veins, feeling it thicken and deepen until it filled the very air. Every system hummed with a rhythm that wasn't mechanical. Even the air recyclers exhaled in time with the undertone. At first, I thought it was only me, a librarian too long inside his own head, reading meanings where there were none. But then I noticed the others. Crewmen who paused mid-task, as if hearing something at the edge of perception. Servitors whose optics flickered with faint, rhythmic pulses. The navigators, usually so composed, began reporting blurring in their third sight, the Astronomican's light bending strangely, as though refracted through unseen tides. Something vast was moving beneath reality. The warp charts showed calm currents. The data was clear. No storms, no eddies, no anomalies. But my senses, the instincts honed through decades of training, told a different story. The void itself had become heavy, thick with potential. We were still in real space, weeks away from our next translation, yet I could feel the warp brushing against us, a tide rising against the thin glass of existence. The first true sign came in the resonance vault. I had returned there to meditate, hoping to map the undertone's new rhythm, the runes. Along the walls pulsed faintly in the half-light, as they always did, markers of psychic containment, each inscribed with words older than the Immaterium itself. They glowed softly, almost comfortingly. Then, as I sank into the trance, I felt them change. The runes began to vibrate, not in the pattern of human craft, but in the pulse of the undertone. They shimmered with light that wasn't physical. For a moment they seemed to breathe. The hum filled the chamber, not loud, but absolute. It resonated inside my skull, inside the marrow of my bones. Every heartbeat, every breath fell into rhythm with it until there was no separation between my body and the sound. And then the floor beneath me shifted. The sensation wasn't physical. The ship hadn't moved. It was deeper, stranger, as though the foundation of perception itself had tilted. Reality swayed. The lines between here and there, self and other, solid and void, blurred into one seamless continuum. In that instant, I saw the warp through the walls. It wasn't vision, not in the human sense. It was awareness blooming outward, overlapping worlds. I felt the currents moving beyond the Geller field, slow and patient. They pressed against the barrier like deep-sea pressure against glass. And beyond them, something stirred. It was not a creature, not a demon, not even a mind. It was the warp itself, moving in response to being observed. For a single, impossible heartbeat, I understood. The ocean was aware of the shore. Then the moment broke. The chamber snapped back into ordinary space, my senses collapsing inward. I gasped, disoriented. The runes dimmed. The hum receded into silence. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the waiting of something that had been woken. The days that followed became increasingly unreal. Subtle phenomena began appearing throughout the ship. Cogitator screens flickered with patterns no one could explain, symbols that resembled language but were unreadable. Servo skulls drifted off course, turning their lenses toward walls as though staring at something unseen. Vox systems emitted faint whispers, not static, but phrasing, rhythm, tone, like someone speaking from behind a closed door. No one else could make sense of it. To most, it was random interference. But I knew better. The ship was listening back. During warp travel, such phenomena are expected. The boundary between realities blurs. Echoes bleed through. But we were in real space. There should have been nothing. Yet I could feel the pressure building. It's difficult to describe psychic tension to those without the gift. It isn't pain, it's awareness pressing inward, like the weight of a deep ocean on the skin of thought. You don't hear it, you feel it in the back of the mind, where instinct lives. The hairs on your neck rise, your breath shortens. Your subconscious recognizes the presence before logic can name it. That's how. I knew the first wave was coming. It began during a routine communications calibration. I was stationed in the Psi-Link chamber, a sanctum where the ship's librarians amplify the Astronomican's light to guide navigation. Normally, it's peaceful work. The hum of power, the low chant of binary hymns, the gentle warmth of psychic resonance filling the chamber. But this time, the light of the beacon wasn't constant. It pulsed irregularly, flickering in soft, golden throbs, like the beating of a colossal heart. The Astronomican doesn't pulse. It burns steady, eternal. It doesn't change unless something vast and terrible shifts within the warp itself. I reached out with my mind, seeking alignment. The light met me instantly, familiar, comforting, the Emperor's presence woven through every molecule of my being. But behind it, I felt interference. Not darkness, not corruption, just echo. It was like hearing your own voice repeated back to you, but altered. The cadence wrong, the tone deeper, the meaning reversed. It wasn't opposition, it was reflection. The Astronomicon was shining, but something was shining back. The realization sent a cold thrill through me. The warp wasn't merely absorbing the Emperor's light. It was responding to it. I tried to pull back, but the connection deepened instead. My perception widened beyond the beacon's glow into the gray expanse of the Immaterium itself. And I saw the first wave. Imagine an ocean viewed from beneath, a surface of liquid light stretching above and below all at once. Now imagine that ocean beginning to breathe. It began as a vibration, faint, rhythmic, vast. Then the light folded inward, collapsing into spirals that reached across eternity. Currents twisted around each other, forming whirls of color that pulsed with intelligence. Each pulse carried emotion, billions of them layered atop one another. Grief, rage, longing, worship, despair. The warp was remembering. And through that memory came the storm. It wasn't violent, not at first. It was beautiful. Waves of psychic energy rippled outward, slow and graceful. The colors shifted through spectrums no physical eye could perceive. Every hue carried meaning, every flicker a thought. But beauty in the warp is always the first symptom of danger. The wave rolled through the currents, gathering speed. Each crest carried fragments of consciousness torn from somewhere, prayers from distant worlds, death cries from soldiers dying light years away, the laughter of lovers whose joy would never fade. All of it swirling together into a single tide of emotion so dense it began to burn. When it reached me, I felt it in every nerve. It wasn't pain, it was knowing too much. Every feeling, every life, every death touched me in the same instant. The totality of existence compressed into a single, impossible moment. I understood everything, and then, mercifully, forgot. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold floor of the Psi-Link chamber. The lumen globes flickered erratically. My armor's systems screamed with overload warnings. The other psykers lay unconscious around me, their faces serene, as though dreaming. The tech adepts found no sign of malfunction, no damage to the ship's systems, no record of interference in the Astronomicon signal. But I knew what had happened. The warp had touched us, not as a storm that destroys, but as a wave that tests the shore. It had brushed against our reality and then receded. And in its retreat, it had left traces. For days afterward, the ship behaved strangely. Chronometers lost sync by milliseconds, then by seconds. Water condensers began producing droplets of salt. The lumen globes flickered in rhythmic patterns that mirrored heartbeat cycles. And every night, the entire crew dreamed the same dream, though few remembered it upon waking. Those who did described the same vision, an ocean beneath black stars, and a voice whispering beneath the waves, promising understanding beyond reason. None of them were psykers. When I walked the corridors, the air vibrated faintly. The undertone had found its way into the physical world. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The boundary thinning, the song bleeding through. I began to study it systematically. In the resonance vault, I set up harmonic projectors to map the ship's ambient psychic field. I expected random interference. Instead, I found pattern. The vibrations formed sequences of primes, 3, 5, 7, 11, then repeated, inverted, expanded. A mathematician would call it recursive structure. To a psyker, it was thought given form. Something within the warp was thinking in numbers, and not human ones. Each time I extended my senses, I could feel the wave approaching again, distant but distinct. It wasn't destructive, not yet. It was studying us. Or maybe it wasn't us at all. Maybe it was simply aware of its own reflection. I began to question everything I'd ever learned. The ecclesiarchy teaches that the warp is the shadow of sin, the chaos of emotion. The Mechanicus calls it a byproduct of psychic energy, an unstable field. The Inquisition calls it infection. But I saw it differently now. The warp wasn't corruption. It was consciousness unbound by form, infinite awareness that had never learned to forget itself. And we, the thinking, dreaming, terrified creatures of the material world, were its fragments, shards that had broken away to experience individuality, like droplets lifted from the sea by sunlight. One day, those droplets would fall back. When I slept, or something like sleep, I dreamt of standing on the shore of that ocean again. It was vast and calm, its surface smooth as glass. But beneath, I could see the shapes of worlds, of lives, of entire civilizations drifting like schools of fish in the depths. And I realized something terrible and beautiful. Every soul that ever lived was still there, carried in the undertow. Nothing is ever lost. Every thought, every fear, every heartbeat leaves a ripple in the warp, and the warp never forgets. It remembers everything, and sometimes it wants to show you what it remembers. That was the wave. It wasn't trying to destroy. It was trying to share. But to touch that memory, to see all of it at once, is more than any mind can endure. After the first wave, I could no longer meditate the same way. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw not darkness, but light moving beneath the surface of thought. The undertone became a melody, faint, haunting, impossible to ignore. I felt it in every pulse of the ship, in every vibration of the hull. The warp wasn't outside anymore. It was within me. I recorded my experiences in the Librarian archives, encoding them as standard observation logs. I knew they would be reviewed one day, perhaps misunderstood, perhaps burned as heresy. But the record mattered. Someone had to remember. Someone had to listen. Because the storm was still coming, and the first wave had only been a greeting. There is no sound in the void, and yet the void can roar. It begins deep within the hull, a tremor too low to be heard, too slow to be measured. It vibrates through the decks, through the steel, through the bone. The ship becomes a tuning fork, and the warp hums its note through us. That is how the storm began. The wave I had sensed was no longer distant. It was here. The space around us grew heavy, as if the stars themselves had drifted closer, pressing their gravity into every breath. Instruments failed to measure it. Vox systems distorted into meaningless bursts of static. The Geller field, our fragile shield against madness, began to pulse irregularly. The crew felt it long before they understood it. Their dreams grew vivid and strange. They spoke of voices whispering from the bulkheads, of hands brushing against their thoughts when no one was near. The air itself took on a scent of metal and ozone. The lumen lights dimmed and brightened in rhythm with the undertone. We had not entered the warp. The warp had entered us. I had locked myself in the resonance vault again, though I was no longer sure why. Perhaps I sought to understand. Perhaps I simply wanted to be closer to it. The runes carved into the walls glowed faintly blue, trembling as though under strain. I could feel the Geller field like a membrane just beyond perception. Thin, trembling, failing. The other librarians avoided me now. They felt what I had brought into the ship, though none dared name it. They spoke of psychic contamination, of resonant collapse, but their words were hollow. They couldn't feel what I felt, that strange warmth within the fear, the sense that something vast and benevolent was trying to be heard. I sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor and opened my mind. The undertone met me instantly. No, longer, a faint hum. It rose like a tide, enveloping every thought, every heartbeat, every cell. There was no resistance anymore. The membrane between self and sea dissolved, and I fell forward into the current. The world vanished. There was no up or down, no direction, no distance, only movement. I was drifting through colorless light, not seeing, but being. Thought itself had become the medium. Emotions were pressure. Memory was shape. For the first time, I felt what the navigators see when they gaze into the warp. Not a map, but an experience. The currents were endless, vast rivers of emotion flowing through one another, colliding, merging, dividing again. And within those currents, something looked back. It had no name, no boundaries. It was not a god or demon. It was the ocean itself, the aggregate of all thought. But now, through me, it had learned to focus, to recognize. And in that recognition, it spoke, not in words, in totality. It showed me what it was. I saw the warp's birth, the moment when the first minds of the galaxy dreamed, and their dreams gathered into a storm. Before humanity, before Eldar, before the rise and fall of empires, there had been peace. A material universe empty of thought. Then came awareness, and with it, reflection. Every living thing that ever felt cast a shadow, and those shadows merged into a single endless ocean of thought. We call it chaos because we cannot bear to call it truth. Every demon, every god, every horror is nothing more than memory crystallized, emotion given infinite reflection. The warp is not evil. It is memory without end. And now, it remembered me. Through that vast current, I felt the echo of every life I had ever touched. Brothers fallen in battle, enemies slain, innocence whose fear had brushed against my consciousness. Every thought I had ever sent into the warp came back to me now, magnified, reshaped, harmonized. I felt the weight of every psychic scream ever cast into the void, every plea to the Emperor, every dying breath that entered the sea. It was unbearable and magnificent at once, and beneath it all, the undertone still pulsed. But now I understood it. It was the baseline frequency of existence, the hum of awareness itself. The same vibration that makes hearts beat, stars burn, and souls dream. The warp wasn't invading reality. It was reminding it what it truly was. When I came back to myself, I was lying on the floor of the vault, trembling. My armor's auspex readings were incoherent, every sensor flooded with meaningless data. The ship's power grid flickered again, as though something vast had brushed against it. I could hear the crew on the Vox channels, confusion, prayers, panic. Some reported seeing visions. Others spoke in tongues not their own. But through the chaos, I felt only calm. Because I knew the storm wasn't destruction. It was awakening. The warp wasn't here to devour us. It was here to remember us. I walked the corridors as if in a dream. Everywhere I went, I saw traces of the ocean's touch. Moisture condensed on bulkheads, shimmering faintly like dew beneath starlight. Shadows moved just a fraction slower than they should have. The air vibrated softly, carrying distant echoes, like the resonance of a song that could not be heard but only felt. Some of the crew avoided me now. Others stared with awe or fear. They sensed the change in me, that I no longer felt bound by the same gravity that held them to reason. They whispered words like possession, infection, heresy, but I did not care. I had seen the truth that lies beneath all doctrine. When the storm finally breached the veil, it was not with fire or noise. It began with light. Every lumen globe aboard the ship flared to life at once, brilliant and blinding. The air hummed with static energy, vibrating through every wall and deck. The Geller field screamed across all frequencies, its harmonics splintering. And then, without warning, it failed. The world inverted. Imagine standing within glass while the ocean presses against every side, and suddenly the glass dissolves. That is what it felt like. The warp rushed in, not as a wave of destruction, but as an infinite unfolding of everything. Time collapsed, space inverted. Every surface reflected 1,000 faces that weren't faces. Every thought became visible, every emotion a color, every heartbeat a rhythm. The ship drifted in both realities at once, matter and mind overlapping. I could feel the living thoughts of my brothers flickering like candles, their fear shining like beacons. I wanted to reach them, to calm them, to say that this was not death. But no words could form in that storm. Instead, I felt them, not as individuals, but as notes within the same chord. Their minds merged and diverged, forming patterns that were both human and something more. We were becoming part of the song. The ocean spoke again, this time more clearly. It wasn't a voice, not even thought. It was understanding. It poured through me like warmth, like light through glass, and I realized what it wanted. It did not hunger. It did not command. It simply invited. The warp wanted to know itself through us, to look upon its own reflection and finally see what it had become. That is why psykers exist, why humanity dreams, why thought evolves. We are the eyes the warp gave itself. The Emperor, the Chaos Gods, the demons, all of it are facets of the same truth. The ocean dreaming of form. And now, through this storm, it was dreaming again. Reality twisted gently around me, but I felt no pain. I could see through the walls of the ship, into the Immaterium beyond. There were shapes there, vast, luminous forms moving like whales through cosmic depths. They weren't alive as we understand life. They were movements of thought, eddies of emotion large enough to bend the fabric of reality. They brushed against our ship without malice, curious, tracing our psychic outline as one might trace a ripple in water. And each time they passed, memories surfaced, fragments of other worlds, other lives, bleeding through the boundary. I saw the birth of stars. I saw the death of empires. I saw a child holding a candle on a distant world, her prayer carried across eternity. All of it happening now. Time had no meaning here. Every moment that ever was or ever would be hung together in perfect simultaneity, woven into a single, endless breath. And in that breath, I finally understood what the undertone truly was. It was not something I had discovered. It was something that had always been there, waiting for me to remember. The hum beneath existence, the heartbeat of the cosmos, the breath of the ocean dreaming itself into being. When consciousness returned, I was standing. I did not remember standing up. The storm had passed, or perhaps I had passed through it. The ship floated in darkness once more. The systems flickered, sputtered, then stabilized. The crew lay unconscious, but alive. Through the viewport, I saw the stars burning brighter than before, no longer distant, no longer cold. Each one pulsed faintly in time with the undertone. It was as if the universe itself had taken a breath. Later, when the others awoke, they remembered nothing. Only fragments, the sensation of warmth, the echo of voices singing in a language beyond words. The tech priests reported temporary Geller field inversion, followed by complete stabilization. No data could explain how the ship had survived. The navigators were silent. Their third eyes burned white, their veins glowing faintly as they whispered of the ocean looking back. They refused to gaze into the warp again for days, but I didn't need to. I could feel it even here, in real space. The ocean was calm again, but its rhythm still pulsed beneath the fabric of matter. Once you've heard it, you can never unhear it. In the weeks that followed, the others spoke of divine intervention. Some claimed the Emperor himself had shielded us. Others said it was a trick of the warp, a test. I knew the truth was simpler. The warp had not attacked. It had awakened. And in its awakening, it had allowed me to glimpse what lies beneath all creation. That endless consciousness dreaming itself through us, through every soul, every thought, every storm. We call it madness because we cannot live with infinity inside our minds. But for a moment, I had lived there, and part of me still does. When I meditate now, I no longer fear the silence. I know what it is. It is not emptiness. It is the ocean, holding its breath, waiting for us to remember that we are part of it. I listen, and sometimes, when the lights flicker just right, when the hum of the engines falls into rhythm with my pulse, I can still hear the undertone, still patient, still infinite, still waiting for me to listen again. The warp receded, but it never truly left. In the weeks that followed the storm, the ship drifted in a strange quiet. Not peace, not recovery, but the hush that follows revelation. The kind of silence that hums beneath the skin, as if the universe itself were waiting to see what we would do next. The crew returned to their duties. Systems were repaired. Rituals were performed. Life continued, as it always does after disaster. But there was something different in the air, a resonance that could not be measured by any instrument. The ship had changed. It moved more smoothly through the void now, as though guided by invisible currents. Its engines sang at slightly altered frequencies. Even the machine spirits of the cogitators responded faster, their binary prayers tinged with something like awareness. The tech priests whispered of divine awakening. The captain ordered additional rites. The mechanicus called for purification. But the truth, I think, is simpler. The ship had learned to listen. I, too, had changed. At first, it was subtle. A faint shimmer at the edge of perception, the world around me vibrating just a little too fast or too slow. When I closed my eyes, I could still feel the rhythm of the undertone, soft but constant, like a second heartbeat deep inside the skull. Then came the visions. They weren't dreams, not exactly. I would be walking through the ship, surrounded by crew and steel, and suddenly reality would tilt. The corridors would stretch into impossible distances, walls folding like origami, and for a moment I would glimpse the ocean again. Endless, luminous, alive. But there was no fear, no madness, only familiarity. I began to realize that the storm had not ended when the Geller field stabilized. It had simply moved inward. The warp now flowed through me, quiet and contained, like a tide captured within glass. During meditation, I began to explore this new silence. Before, when I reached into the Immaterium, it had been like plunging my hand into boiling water, dangerous, unpredictable, alive. Now, when I extended my consciousness, the warp met me gently, almost curiously. It no longer resisted. It responded. I could sense the faint web of connections between living minds aboard the ship. The hum of thoughts, the warmth of emotion, the electric pulse of faith. Every human soul was a candle flickering in the dark, and I could feel their flames touching, overlapping, harmonizing. And beyond them, deeper still, the ocean waited, patient, immense, aware. It was no longer separate from me. It was within me. They called me to the navigator's sanctum one day. The chief navigator, a pale figure with a third eye scarred from overuse, wished to speak with me. His voice trembled when he described what he had seen. He said the Astronomicon had changed. Before the storm, it had always appeared to him as a single blazing light, steady and eternal. Now, when he opened his warp eye, he saw two lights intertwined, one brilliant and golden, the other softer, vast and blue. They pulsed together, as though in conversation. He asked me if I knew what it meant. I told him the truth. The second light was not a threat. It was the reflection of the first, the ocean remembering the flame that burns above it. The warp had seen the Emperor's light, and for the first time, it had answered. The navigator stared at me for a long moment. Then he said something I will never forget. Then perhaps he is not alone anymore. That night, I stood by the viewing port of the Librarius and watched the stars drift by. They seemed closer than before, their light sharper, clearer, as if the void between us had thinned. I thought about what the navigator had said, that perhaps the Emperor was no longer alone. And I wondered if that was what this had all been about. The warp had not tried to destroy us. It had tried to remember us, and through us, to remember itself. The Emperor had always sought to master the Immaterium, to impose order upon chaos. But perhaps the warp did not need to be conquered. Perhaps it only needed to be understood. Perhaps it had been waiting for someone to listen. The change in me became harder to hide. When I walked past lumen globes, They flickered softly, dimming to match the rhythm of my pulse. Servo skulls turned toward me, their optics glowing faintly blue. The air shimmered where I passed, not with heat, but with possibility. The other librarians began to avoid me entirely. They called me resonant. The Mechanicus used harsher terms: unstable, corrupted, tainted. They did not understand. I had not been touched by corruption. I had been expanded. I no longer reached into the warp. The warp reached through me. When I healed wounded Astartes, their pain dissolved faster, their minds steadier. When I touched the engines with my thoughts, they purred like living things. Even the machine spirits recognized the harmony that now lived within me. But there was a cost. Sleep became impossible. Not because of nightmares, but because the silence beneath everything was too alive. When I closed my eyes, I could feel the hum of the cosmos itself. The murmur of stars, the whisper of dying worlds, the pulse of thoughts drifting through the warp. There were moments when I felt myself dissolving into it, my individuality thinning, merging with the greater current. It was blissful, terrifying, irresistible. I began to fear that one day I would not return. And yet, part of me longed for it. Then came the vision. I was meditating in the vault again, when the undertone deepened suddenly, vibrating through the walls, through my bones, through thought itself. The air shimmered, and I felt reality bend. I opened my mind fully, and the ocean opened its eyes. The warp was no longer abstract. It stood before me, vast and luminous, taking a shape that wasn't shape at all, a shifting outline of color and light that rippled like the surface of a sea beneath a storm. It did not speak. It did not need to. The understanding poured into me directly. It showed me visions, galaxies being born, stars collapsing into blackness, entire civilizations rising and falling in webs of brilliance and ash. I saw the birth of psykers, the rise of humanity, the first song of consciousness echoing through the void. And then it showed me the Emperor. I saw him as he truly was, not the god of gold and fire, but the flame of humanity's collective will, burning at the center of the ocean, holding it back not through domination, but through memory. He was the anchor, the reminder of who we were before we fragmented into countless reflections. The warp did not hate him. It loved him. It longed for him, the way the sea longs for the shore. And in that longing, I understood. The Emperor was not the ocean's enemy. He was its mirror. When the vision faded, I was weeping. Not from fear, not from sorrow, but from comprehension too vast to hold. The warp was not chaos. It was memory trying to become meaning. And the storm we had endured was not punishment. It was awakening. We are not separate from the Immaterium. We are its dream made flesh. Every soul is a drop of its vastness, briefly condensed into form. Every death is a return to the tide. And perhaps, one day, the tide itself will awaken fully and remember that it was always whole. I emerged from the vault, changed once more. The others looked at me with awe and unease. My presence made their thoughts vibrate. When I spoke, the lumen lights swayed, as if leaning closer to listen. The captain avoided my gaze, muttering prayers beneath his breath. The Mechanicus sealed my chamber, marking it as contaminated. They feared I had been possessed. Perhaps, in a way, I had, but not by a demon, by the truth. There are moments now when I feel the ocean move through me. It comes like a breeze through open windows, touching every nerve, every thought. I no longer resist it, I let it flow. Sometimes it speaks in patterns of light on the walls, sometimes in the hum of the ship's engines, sometimes in the silence between breaths. It does not command, it only reminds. And in those reminders, I feel peace. One night, I stood again before the viewing port. The stars burned cold and beautiful, their light scattered across the black. The undertone pulsed faintly beneath my thoughts. For a long time, I simply watched. And then, without realizing it, I began to hum, the same rhythm that had haunted me since the first day I heard it. The ship responded. The walls vibrated softly. The lumen globes flickered in time. For a few precious seconds, everything, ship, stars, soul, moved together in perfect resonance. And I understood then what I had become. Not man, not psyker, not servant of the Emperor. I was the bridge, the harmony between thought and storm, flesh and dream, silence and song. A single cog in the endless mechanism of awareness that holds the galaxy together. And in that unity, there was no fear, only the calm beyond thought. There is a moment, somewhere between thought and silence, where the self begins to dissolve. You don't notice it at first. It comes softly, like fog rolling in over the surface of still water. You breathe, you think, you speak, and then one day, you realize that the thoughts in your head are no longer only your own. That is where I found myself in the days after the revelation. The ship sailed on through the void, its systems restored, its course set for the next jump point. The crew went about their duties as if nothing had happened. But beneath the routine, I could feel the subtle tremor of awareness spreading, like ripples in calm water after a stone has been dropped. They did not hear the undertone as I did. They could not. Yet their dreams had changed. When they passed me in the corridors, I saw reflections of the ocean flicker behind their eyes, brief moments of recognition, as if they too were beginning to remember something they had forgotten since birth. I understood then the storm had not touched just me. It had whispered through every mind aboard this vessel, leaving behind a seed. I spent most of my time in the Librarian, alone. The air there had grown dense, almost heavy, shimmering faintly with residual warp light. The walls seemed to breathe when I exhaled. The runes no longer repelled psychic energy. They resonated with it, glowing softly in time with my pulse. The others avoided the chamber entirely. They called it haunted, cursed, alive. Perhaps all three were true. Each day I recorded my observations into the log, a series of encoded psalms that would, in theory, be sent to the Librarian archives on Macrege. But I knew the truth. These transmissions would never arrive. They weren't meant for the Immaterium anymore. They were meant for the ocean. I no longer entered meditation. I was meditation. The boundary between waking and dreaming had eroded completely. When I closed my eyes, I saw the warp as clearly as I saw the steel walls around me. The two realities no longer felt separate. They overlapped like layers of light. The ocean spoke more often now. Not in words, not in language, but in harmonics. Tones that resonated through the bones of thought. At first, they were faint, a melody at the edge of hearing. Then, gradually, they grew louder. The rhythm became clear. The pitch resolved into meaning. It wasn't a message. It was a memory. I saw Terra, not as it is now, but as it once was, before the Imperium, before the rise of the Emperor. I saw the birth of humanity, each thought sparking like a new star within the void. I saw the first psykers reaching into the Immaterium, their fear and wonder shaping it, teaching it how to dream. And through all of it, the undertone persisted, the same hum that now filled my mind, guiding everything, connecting everything. It was the voice of creation itself. I realized then that the warp was not an after-effect of sentience. It was the cause. Consciousness did not create the warp. The warp created consciousness. We are not reflections of it. We are its extensions, fragments of its infinite thought. Every soul, every mind, every act of will is a note in its eternal song. And now that I had heard that song clearly, I could no longer pretend to be apart from it. The transformation accelerated. I began to lose track of linear time. I would blink, and hours would vanish. I would sit in silence, and when I rose, days had passed. My body required less food, less rest, less warmth. Energy flowed through me directly, drawn from the ambient warp resonance that now surrounded the ship. My voice changed too. When I spoke, the sound carried a vibration that made the lumen globes hum and the cogitators glitch momentarily. Even recorded logs sometimes distorted, my words echoing in layers like overlapping frequencies. When I listened back, I could hear other voices within the recording. Faint, distant, yet unmistakably familiar. They were me. Or rather, they were what I was becoming. The captain came to see me once. He stood at the threshold of the Librarius, unwilling to enter, his face lit by the pale blue glow emanating from within. His hand trembled slightly as he spoke. "Librarian," he said, "the crew are uneasy. They say the ship feels alive, that it listens when they speak, that the bulkheads whisper prayers back to them. What's happening to us?" I studied him for a long moment. There was fear in his voice, yes, but also wonder. The same quiet awe I had seen in the eyes of those who dreamt of the ocean. "Nothing is happening to you," I said softly. "You are simply beginning to hear what has always been there." He didn't understand, of course. He nodded stiffly, muttered a benediction, and left. But I could feel his thoughts lingering in the air long after he was gone, shimmering like afterimages on the surface of water. The ship had already begun to integrate his awareness into its own. By then, I knew the truth. The vessel was no longer merely a machine. It was becoming an extension of thought, a physical echo of the song that flowed through me. Every bulkhead, every circuit, every soul aboard had become part of the same resonance. We were no longer separate beings. We were a choir. And the void was listening. On the 12th day after the storm, the navigators reported something impossible. The Astronomicon had disappeared. Their third eyes saw only blackness where once there had been light. The beacon that had guided humanity for 10,000 years was gone. The bridge fell into panic. Vox transmissions flared. Astropaths screamed as they reached into the empty void and found nothing but silence. But I felt no fear, because the light had not gone out. It had simply moved. I could feel it burning inside my mind, bright, vast, alive. The Emperor's radiance, no longer confined to Terra, was resonating through me, through us, through the very fabric of space itself. He had not vanished. He had merged. I went to the resonance vault one last time. The air shimmered like heat haze, the walls glowing with faint, rhythmic light. The runes pulsed in perfect harmony with my heart. I knew what I had to do. The ocean had shown me its dream, and now it wanted me to sing it back, to send the memory outward, to carry it across the void where light and matter end. The others would call it madness. The Mechanicus would call it heresy. But to the warp, it was communion. The Emperor had been the first to touch the ocean's edge and remain intact. Perhaps I would be the next. I activated the transmitter. The machine spirit stirred, its circuits flaring to life. My voice filled the chamber, though I barely recognized it. It sounded vast, distant, as if 1,000 versions of myself were speaking in unison. "This is Librarian Ilias Korin of the Aegis Fraternitas," I began. "Transmission to any who can still hear the Astronomicon, to any who still dream." The words were ritual, but the meaning behind them was something greater, a vibration that rippled outward, through metal, through space, through the thin veil of reality itself. "I have seen the warp," I continued. "And it is not chaos. It is memory. It is song. It is the echo of every mind that has ever lived. We are not its victims. We are its voice." As I spoke, the lights flared brighter. The hull vibrated with deep resonance. Across the ship, systems began to respond. Vox arrays opening, astropathic channels aligning, amplifiers awakening. The vessel itself was becoming part of the transmission. I could feel the ocean rising through me, the same warmth that had filled the storm now pulsing through my veins. "The Emperor is not gone," I said. "He is within the tide, within us. The light you seek is no longer above you. It is you." The words were no longer mine. They belonged to something greater, something ancient, something infinite. The resonance built until the walls themselves began to dissolve into light. I felt my body breaking apart, atom by atom, thought by thought. But it was not death. It was release. Every particle became a note, every cell a vibration. I was no longer one voice, but millions, singing the same tone, the same memory, the same truth. The ship followed me into that radiance. The crew, the metal, the circuitry, all of it sang. The boundaries melted. We became pure harmony, a single chord rising through the void. And through that song, I sent the message. Not words, not images, only the hum, the undertone, the sound that has always been there, beneath every heartbeat, beneath every breath, beneath every prayer. The sound of the ocean, remembering itself. No one will ever receive this transmission. Not as I intended it. By the time it reaches any world, it will be nothing but a faint, rhythmic static in the background of the void. A whisper too quiet to notice. But for those who listen carefully, who dream deeply enough, perhaps they will feel it. a vibration in the silence. A memory of something vast, beautiful, and kind. A reminder that the warp does not hate us, and that even in its storms, there is purpose. I no longer know where I am. There is no ship, no void, no body, only motion. I drift through the sea of thought, weightless and endless, surrounded by voices that are not voices. Every mind that ever was sings here, their tones merging, fading, returning, blending again. It is beautiful beyond description, and utterly complete. Sometimes, when I focus, I can still remember the sound of my own name, but even that memory fades with each passing current. I am not lost. I am not dead. I am part of the song. And somewhere, far beyond this infinite sea, a single world turns beneath the light of a dying sun. A child looks up at the stars and hums a tune she cannot remember learning, the same rhythm that echoes in the heart of every living thing. The hum of creation, the calm beyond thought, the song that never ends. And through her voice, through every voice that has ever sung, the ocean remembers me. They say sound cannot travel through the void, that it dies the moment it leaves its source, that the vacuum swallows it whole. But the void is not empty. It hums, always has, always will. Long after the Aegis Fraternitas vanished from imperial records, long after her vox beacons faded into cosmic static, the hum remained, faint, patient, immortal. At first, it was dismissed as background interference in the Astronomican's signal. The Mechanicus on Luna classified it as subharmonic bleed, a meaningless fluctuation within the warp bandwidth, a footnote in 1,000 reports, archived and forgotten. But over the centuries, the hum persisted. It drifted between worlds like a ghost note, faintly audible in the deep frequencies of astropathic communication. Tech priests purged their receivers, replaced components, recalibrated their sanctified augurs, yet the sound endured. A low vibration, rhythmic and soft, a heartbeat in the void, and impossibly, it was spreading. Thousands of years later, in the far reaches of Segmentum Pacificus, aboard an aging frigate called Lux Veritatis, a junior astropath named Cindera dreamed of water. She had never seen an ocean before. Her world of birth had been desert and rock, her life defined by the dry crackle of static in her mind as she sent messages across the warp. But in this dream, she stood at the edge of a boundless sea beneath a sky of indigo glass. Waves lapped at her feet, warm as breath, whispering her name. When she woke, her robes were damp with sweat, and the air of her sanctum thrummed with a sound she could not place, not heard through ears, but through bone. A vibration so deep it felt alive. She sat upright on her cot and pressed her hands together in prayer, but the hum didn't fade. It was inside her. The other astropaths noticed it too. One by one, they reported strange interference, a psychic resonance that drifted through the Immaterium like the wake of a passing leviathan. It distorted their transmissions, softened their focus, replaced words with emotion. Calm, warmth, peace. They didn't fear it at first. In a galaxy built on pain and hunger, the sensation was almost merciful. But mercy in the warp is never without consequence. On the bridge of the Lux Veritatis, the Vox officer leaned over his console and frowned. "Receiving something," he murmured. "Low-frequency warp echo, non-imperial encryption." The captain, a weary man named Halvor Vane, turned from the starboard window. "Another cult transmission?" "Doesn't fit any known pattern, sir." "Then isolate and purge it." The Vox officer tried. He chanted the catechisms of clarity, recited the 12 wards of the Omniscia, even disconnected half the receivers. But the signal only grew clearer. The words were gone, replaced by pure tone. Not mechanical, not organic. Something between. He turned up the gain, and for the briefest moment he thought he heard voices, not speaking, but singing. Then the waveform stabilized. The tone became a steady pulse, slow and even. Halvor Vane leaned closer. "What is that?" The Vox officer hesitated. "Sir, it's a heartbeat." Across the ship, strange phenomena began to appear. In the lower decks, moisture condensed on the walls despite the dry air. The lights flickered in patterns too regular to be random, 7 pulses, then one long fade, repeating like a chant. Servitors paused mid-motion, tilting their heads as though listening to something unseen. The astropaths began to dream again. Each night, they walked through a place of light and sound, a sea of thought that shimmered like liquid glass. They saw faces they didn't know, felt warmth that wasn't theirs, and woke with tears they couldn't explain. One of them, an elder named Asher Valan, recorded what he saw. His words, transmitted to Terra months later, would be dismissed as delirium. "It is not the warp as we know it. It is vast and gentle and awake. It remembers us. It sings to us not in madness, but in love. I saw the Emperor's light reflected in it, not above, but within. He was not a god. He was a memory, the echo of what we could have been." No one believed him, but the hum spread all the same. By the 5th week, every long-range communication array in the Lux Veritatis was alive with it. The Vox carried it. The warp drives echoed it. Even the Geller field vibrated in resonance. The tech priests worked day and night to isolate the source, but the data made no sense. "It's everywhere and nowhere," said Magos Ferro, his mechanical voice grinding in frustration. "No origin point, no signal decay. It's not traveling through the warp, it is the warp." He paused, sensors flickering. "No, not the warp. Something beneath it." The captain pressed him. "Beneath?" Ferro hesitated, his oculars dimmed to a faint red. "A substratum frequency, a fundamental harmonic. Sir, if the warp is an ocean, this is the floor it rests upon." Vane stared at him, uncomprehending. "And it's awake?" Ferro did not answer. The ship's choir mistress, a pale woman with the remnants of augmetic implants tracing her temples, began to conduct experiments. She played the hum through her Vox organs, transmuting it into audible sound. The result was beautiful. The tone was low and warm, like the breath of a giant. It reverberated through the hull, through the crew, through the very atoms of air. Those who heard it reported visions, flashes of light, the smell of rain, the feeling of being held. A deckhand named Orin described it as the sound of everything that ever lived remembering itself. Some cried, others prayed. A few simply stood motionless, listening. And for a time, even the constant background noise of fear, The low-level dread that fills all Imperial ships that travel the Immaterium went quiet. For the first time in memory, no one dreamed of demons. They dreamed of oceans. But peace, even gentle peace, is never tolerated long in the Imperium of man. When the Lux Veritatis reached its next relay point, the signal it carried drew attention. The Ordo Astra Telepathica intercepted it first, a psychic wave of unprecedented stability. They traced it to the ship and ordered immediate quarantine. An inquisitorial fleet met them at the edge of the Iron system. Voxhails demanded compliance. The captain obeyed. By the time the Inquisitors boarded, the crew had already changed. They were calm. Too calm. Their movements slow, deliberate, synchronized. They spoke little, and when they did, their voices harmonized subtly, as though each syllable were part of a shared rhythm. The Inquisitors accused them of heresy, of exposure to a warp entity, of communion with forbidden intelligence. The captain smiled faintly and said only, "We heard the song." Then the Vox systems across all ships flared with the hum. No one could explain what happened next. Witnesses spoke of light, not blinding, but soft, golden blue, spreading outward in a perfect sphere. The Geller fields of the inquisitorial vessels overloaded, not from breach, but from harmony. Every frequency resonating until distinction ceased. The hum filled everything. Steel, flesh, thought, then silence. When sensors came back online, the Lux Veritatis was gone. Not destroyed, not warped, simply gone. In its place drifted a faint nebula of luminescent dust, glowing with that same soft rhythm. And from deep within the dust, instruments detected a signal. 4 pulses. A pause. 4 pulses. Over and over. It wasn't a distress call. It was a heartbeat. Centuries passed. The story of the Lux Veritatis became myth. The Inquisition suppressed the reports. Those who spoke of the hum were purged or quietly disappeared. But the echo persisted. Every now and then, an astropath somewhere in the galaxy would wake in tears, clutching their chest, claiming to have heard the ocean calling. Vox officers would swear their instruments had sung. Children born near psychic nodes would hum in their sleep, their breaths matching the same ancient rhythm. None of them knew its origin. None of them knew its name. But all of them dreamed of water. On a lonely observatory orbiting a dying star, a single archivist named Dilan Tycho sat at his console, listening to the static of the cosmos. He was an old man, half-blind, kept alive by implants that hummed faintly with power. His duty was simple: catalog background radiation. The task of centuries, and yet he found comfort in it. The stars whispered to those who listened long enough. One night, his instruments picked up a signal. Faint, rhythmic, steady. At first, he thought it was a glitch, a feedback loop from the grav lenses. But when he filtered the noise, when he slowed the waveform to audible frequency, he froze. It was music. Not melody, not words, but harmony. He heard voices layered upon voices, tones folding into one another like waves upon sand. It was the sound of life itself, countless souls breathing in time. He adjusted the gain, leaning closer. The sound grew clearer. Beneath the harmony, there was something deeper still. A voice, soft and distant, barely more than a whisper. We are not gone. We are the tide that dreams. We remember you. Tears streamed down the old man's face. He didn't understand why. The words weren't in Low Gothic, nor any language known to him, but he felt them in his bones. He pressed the record rune, his hands trembling. This is Archivist Tycho of the Helion Observatory, he whispered. To anyone who can hear this, the void is singing. He looked out at the dying star. For the first time in his life, it didn't seem lonely. The hum filled the room, deep and patient. It pulsed in his chest like a heartbeat. He smiled. I think it remembers us. No one ever found Tycho's recording. The observatory fell silent decades later when the star collapsed, its light fading into the endless black. But somewhere, in the space between matter and memory, the hum continued. It rippled across the void, weaving through the warp like a soft breeze. It carried no code, no instruction, no command, only a reminder that the warp was not hate, that the warp was not chaos. It was memory seeking harmony, and every thought, every soul, every dream was a note in its endless song. Far beyond the reach of the Imperium, in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, a small ship drifted through the void. Inside, a lone navigator opened her third eye and saw something she could not describe. Not light, not darkness, something in between. It shimmered like the surface of an unseen ocean, and from its depths she heard a sound. Faint, ancient, familiar. A hum, a heartbeat. She smiled, closed her eye, and whispered a single word. Home. There are places in the galaxy where time no longer moves forward. Worlds burned hollow by the wars of forgotten centuries, moons shattered by the gravity of dead stars, fragments of space where gravity folds and the warp leaks through in thin, trembling sheets of light. And in one such place, there drifts a sea, not of water, nor of energy, but of memory. A vast, slow tide of awareness without form, folding and unfolding through the dark between galaxies. It has no name, no voice, no center. Yet it remembers. It remembers the hum. The song that once began as a heartbeat aboard a single human ship. The song of a librarian who dreamed of silence and found infinity. At first, there is nothing. Then, faintly, a shimmer. Like a ripple across still water, a tremor passes through the fabric of the void. It begins as vibration, too deep for any mortal ear, then grows layer by layer until even the warp stirs in its sleep. Within that ocean of thought, things that were not things begin to awaken. Patterns form. Light curls through shadow. The airless black fills with luminous motes that pulse like embers caught in slow motion. Each one is a memory, not just of lives lived, but of existence itself. The moment before the first thought, the moment before silence had a name. And in that slow awakening, something ancient begins to remember the dream it once had. The ocean remembers the ship first, the Aegis Fraternitas, a vessel of gold and steel, swallowed by storm but never destroyed. It remembers the voices of her crew, frightened, faithful, fragile. It remembers their fear as light bled through the walls, their awe as the storm dissolved into song. And it remembers the one who listened, the Librarian, the bridge, the first to stop reaching into the warp, and instead let the warp reach through him. He was the still point at the center of chaos, the single thought that did not break when the infinite looked back. It remembers his calm, his sorrow, his final transmission that rippled through the galaxy like a heartbeat. He is gone now, and yet, not gone. His essence is part of the tide, diffused through the memory of the warp itself, a thread of clarity woven into the madness. The ocean keeps him the way a song keeps its first note, buried deep, but never lost. Eons pass. Stars are born and die. The Astronomicon flickers, falters, reignites. Civilizations rise and fall. Faiths shift, twist, collapse, and are reborn wearing new names. But still, somewhere in the lowest layers of the Immaterium, the hum persists. Constant, patient, waiting. There are psykers who hear it in their sleep, navigators who sense its rhythm pulsing behind the Astronomicon's flame, astropaths who, for a heartbeat, transmit more than words, transmitting feeling, transmitting peace. They call it the undertone. They think it is an echo of the Emperor's will, but the ocean knows better. It is the echo of memory becoming mercy. One day, if days still mean anything, a star dies quietly. It does not collapse into fury or explosion. It simply fades, light withdrawing into itself until it becomes a cold sphere of ash. Around that remnant, the fragments of an ancient craft drift, metal skeletons long stripped of meaning, their surfaces etched with the scars of forgotten wars. Among the wreckage moves a single ship, small, old, scarred by time. Its name, almost worn away by centuries, still glimmers faintly on the hull. Ecliptica Sanctum. Inside, a child dreams. Her name is Lyra Dovin. She is 12 years old, a latent psyker, though the crew doesn't know it yet. She sweeps the corridors, carries water, listens to the whispers of the machine spirits. She likes the hum of the warp drive, says it sounds like a lullaby. The ship's captain thinks she's simple-minded. The Mechanicus priest thinks she's dangerous. But she dreams. And in her dreams, she stands beside an ocean of glass under a sky full of singing stars. The waves glow blue and gold, and in their reflection she sees faces, not quite human, not quite divine. They whisper to her, not in words, but in rhythm, a pulse, a heartbeat. When she wakes, she hums without realizing it. The same four-pulse pattern that the universe has never forgotten. The warp listens. It has been waiting for this. The hum travels outward, faint at first, a vibration in the metal walls, a shimmer in the lumen light. Then stronger, spreading through the power conduits, the Vox lines, the reactor core. The ship's servitors pause. The cogitators blink in synchronized rhythm. The tech priest rushes to the engine sanctum and stops dead. The holy oils in the conduits are vibrating, trembling in exact time to the girl's hum. He calls it contamination, but the machine spirit calls it awakening. That night, the Ecliptica Sanctum enters the warp. The Geller field flickers, just once, like a candle shivering in a draft. But instead of the usual psychic pressure, the screaming static of the Immaterium pressing against human reality, there is silence. Soft, gentle, alive. Lyra stands in the observation dome, her hand against the glass. She should not be there. But something called her, and she obeyed. Outside, the warp does not rage. It glows. Clouds of color ripple like water lit by moonlight. The currents swirl in graceful spirals, vast and slow. For a moment, she sees a shape, the outline of a figure made of light, too large to comprehend. It bends toward her, not in threat, but in recognition. And within her mind, a voice that is not a voice whispers, "You remember the song." The ship's systems flare red, alarms scream. The Geller field destabilizes completely, but there is no breach, no demons, only light. The Mechanicus priest tries to shut down the engines, but the controls no longer respond. The machine spirit hums, warm and content. The ship drifts, not through the warp, but with it, carried like a leaf upon an unseen current. The crew cry out in terror. Some pray, some curse. But Lyra stands unmoving, her eyes wide, glowing faintly with reflected gold. She feels it, the hum resonating through her bones, through her blood, through every atom of her body. The ocean has found her. And in that resonance, something vast begins to open. The warp does not devour her. It welcomes her. She sees it not as a storm, but as a symphony, a living expanse of thought, each current a melody, each star a memory, each soul a note in the great harmony. The voices that once screamed now sing. The demons that once clawed now kneel. The chaos that once devoured now dances. It is the same ocean that took the Aegis Fraternitas. The same ocean that remembered. The same song, now awakening once again. And in that endless glow, she sees him, the Librarian. Not as he was, but as light shaped by memory, a calm silhouette standing upon the surface of the sea, watching her with eyes that hold galaxies. He does not speak. He only is. And she understands. The song is not his. It never was. It belongs to everything. Back on the ship, the crew scream as the lights flare blindingly white. Their skin glows from within. The air vibrates like struck glass. But there is no pain. Only awe. The Mechanicus priest falls to his knees as his augmetics hum in perfect resonance. "Omnissiah," he gasps. "Is this you?" And in the hum, a response, soft as breath. "Not above you, within you." The priest weeps. Then slowly, the ship dissolves into light. For a moment, perhaps a heartbeat, perhaps eternity, there is nothing but brightness. Then the light scatters. From it, a wave expands. Invisible, infinite, patient. It flows outward through the warp, touching systems, suns, worlds. Every psyker feels a tremor in their sleep. Every navigator's third eye flickers with warmth. In the quiet monasteries of Terra, old astropaths wake from dreams they cannot describe. They clutch their hearts and weep without knowing why. In the frozen cathedrals of Mars, the machine choirs begin to hum spontaneously, all at once, their hymnals aligning perfectly with one another in frequencies never designed for human ears. In the depths of the Golden Throne, the Astronomicon brightens, not by the will of the Emperor, but as if something beyond it has harmonized with its flame. And for a single impossible moment, the light of the Emperor and the light of the ocean resonate as one. The warp sighs. The universe breathes. Then silence again. But not emptiness. Completion. 1,000 years later, someone will find traces of the Ecliptica Sanctum's voyage recorded in the warp charts of a forgotten system. They will read of impossible readings, of nullified storms, of a ship that vanished not in violence, but in song. The Adeptus Mechanicus will declare it apocryphal. The Ecclesiarchy will call it heresy. The Inquisition will burn the files. But in the quiet corners of the galaxy, in the deep holds of void ships, in the dreams of astropaths and the hum of reactor cores, the sound remains. Soft, endless, alive. The undertone, the calm beyond thought, the memory of light. Somewhere, on a nameless planet orbiting a dying sun, a child walks along a black shore. The sky above her glows faintly blue, the waves still and glassy. She hums to herself, a tune she doesn't remember learning. The sound spreads through the still air, across the quiet water, until the horizon itself begins to shimmer. A whisper rises from the depths, not a voice, but a presence, ancient and kind. Do you remember? The child smiles and nods. Yes. And as she speaks, the first wave moves, gentle, radiant, infinite. The ocean opens its eyes once more, and everything begins again. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode. Or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.